There we go. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final session on how to create a web timer application in React.js. So in today's fourth and final session, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking the timer right here, and we're going to be changing it so that it will allow us to log times. And what this allows for us to do is we can just, go do the timer for a little bit, stop it, log the time, reset it, log another time, and then after we're finished logging times, we can look at those, or we can trash them if we need to. So that's basically what we're going to be incorporating in this fourth and final session: the ability to save the times or save several different time logs, I guess, if you want to call it like that. So this is where we are right now. So that's where we need to get to. So first, what we need to do is we need to go and we need to start implementing Redux. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to do yarn add. In all the other tutorials, I think in the previous tutorials we added it, but just for just for safeguarding, we're gonna do it again. So yarn add Redux, React Redux, and then Redux logger. Okay. So now we can go over here and we can start adding all the Redux stuff. So first thing we want to do is we want to actually create a constant called test. We're going to be using this later on. So go into constants thing, make sure you have index.js. This is going to be a Redux action. Okay, this is going to be like so, right? So that's our test thing. Also, we're going to have a new folder called actions. Inside that one, we're going to have another index.js. It's going to import directly from constants. And the only thing that we're going to import from now is just test. So we're going to import those. And what we do is we export, actions basically. So in this one, we're going to be doing run test, and this returns a value of that's type of test, and that's it. There's no payload, right? So that's just a testing function for Redux when we get into it more later on. So next thing, we're going to add a folder. We're going to call it store. We're going to also add another folder. We're going to call it reducers. Basically, what reducers allow us to do is it allows us to modify certain parts of the Redux container, basically. So in the store folder, we're going to add a file called index.js, same as last time. Then we're going to import create store, apply middleware from Redux. We're going to import root reducer from reducers, but we didn't create that yet. We're gonna import create logger from Redux logger. We're gonna create that logger. This logs all the things that are happening to Redux. Then finally, we just can create our store, or our Redux store. And this will take in the reducer function and then the apply middleware thing function, which will have variable of logger as the parameter. So that's our store. Then we need to go in here. We have to create a new file called index.js, and inside this one, we're going to import combine reducers from Redux. And this is where we're going to import our reducers. But for now, we're going to do export constant root reducer, and then this will just be state action with the arrow function, then return the state, and our initial state is just going to be null for now, but we're going to change this later on. So now within here we want to actually, within our app.js, this is where we want to start importing the Redux store. So what we'll do is we'll do here, import the Redux store, input store from /store, then import provider from React Redux. Then we just go here to our app, then we just put it in a huge provider, set the store equal to store in curly brackets, closing tag, then we take all of this, right, and we put it in here. So now, and to test it, so we can see if it works, we're going to go into our constructor function. We're going to do store.dispatch, and then we'll just do, here we'll import the actions that we need to do. Import run test from /actions, right? And then we'll just put the run test function in here, right? So like this store.dispatch run test. So now when we go here and we look on the right side of our application in the developer console, and when we look in the developer console, we see action test, pref state null, then the actual action itself, and then next state's null. So that means that it works. So, but we're not gonna just interface with just null, we're gonna do other things with it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna modify a reducer, and what we want is we're gonna want to have a field in our Redux state or Redux container, whatever you want to call it, that will store our track time. So we'll call this tracktimes.js. We're going to import Lodash. We're going to use that later. Then we're going to import Redux constants from here, and then we're going to do export constant tracked times equals state, and then state will be empty for now. Then the action arrow function to here. Then we're going to check the type, and by default we're just going to return the state, right? Then we're going to go back here, we're going to import the reducer here, tracked times from tracked times, and instead of doing this we're going to just use the helper function combine reducers, and then we'll put the track times variable in like this, and we're going to put it in curly brackets like that. So now when we go back and we look at the test action, you see that now we have a track times field, which is an empty array. And there's two things that we want to do, or two ways we're going to be modifying the state. We're going to be adding times, and we're going to be removing times. So we're going to have two new constants in the constants thing. One of them is going to be export constant add time, right? Another one is going to be export constant delete time, right? And then we have to have the corresponding actions in here. So we'll just import those two new constants here, and then we'll create the corresponding action functions. So this is, we'll take in time, so the time as a variable, this will be add time, the payload contains time, like that. Then we're going to have a second one, delete time, and this will take in time IDX, we'll go into an arrow function, and then this will be delete time, and the payload will be time IDX. This is the index for the time that we want to delete. So those are the two actions that we're going to have for the Redux system. So before we get started on actually incorporating these functions, one thing we want to do is we want to import these new constants here. So import add time and then delete time from constants. And then the next thing we want to do is, if we look back at our application, which we were running this time in the background, we see we have the stop button. We don't really need the stop button. It actually messes with tracking the times. Plus, if you really need to reset it, you can just do this, and they'll reset it. Or if you actually need to stop the timer, quote unquote stop the timer, you can just use the pause button. So we're gonna just remove that stop button from the timer component right here. So, because we don't need this anymore. So now if we go back, don't have it anymore. And then, so to start, what we want to do is we want to have these things called containers. And containers basically passes special functions to our components that allows our components to run functions that interact with the Redux state. So we're going to create a new folder, and it's going to be called containers. We're going to create a new container. We're going to call it a timer container. And in this one, we're going to import connect from React Redux. We're going to import the time component from, well, the timer component from the components folder. Right? We're going to have a function called map state to props, like that. We're going to have a second variable, or second function called map dispatch to props, and this will have a dispatch function like that. And then finally, we're going to export default connect, the map state the props, the map dispatch the props, and then the timer itself. And what we want it to have is, if we're going to have these actions, right, we want it to import the add time action from the actions folder, like that. We're going to have it map a function to this called add time, like last time. This will have the time. This dispatches the add time function like that, basically. So now when we go in here, when we go back into our app.js, when we're importing the timer component, right, instead of importing it from here, we're actually going to import it from containers, timer container, right? And then in our timer, we can log the properties to see what's going on, right? And now if we look at the properties for our timer component, we see that we now have an object, or that's our properties, and inside of our properties we have a function called add time, and it takes in one argument, which is the time, right? So what we can do then is we can add a new button here. We'll call this the log button, and then a button, on click, this dot log time. We'll add this function later. It's going to be button block, button secondary for the color, and then this will just say log time. So then we're going to have this log time function, right? So we'll put the log time function here, log time, right there, and then we go all the way here. I'm going to bind that function. And then we go back to this function right here, and we're going to have it where it runs the add time function, and it passes current time values, right? So now if you go back here, when we hit log time, or when we do this, right, we hit log time, then it passes the data that has an add time action, right? Then the payload, and we go to payload, we have this time counter thing, but what we're going to do is we're going to parse this counter, and then we're going to actually return a new state that will have the time appended to it. So by doing, the way we're going to do that is we go back to our reducers in track time, well, the track time reducer. Okay, so we're going to go into our track time reducer, and we're going to check for add time, and we're going to get the time field, which will equal the payload, and we're going to destructure it. We're going to get the parse time, and we're going to use this trick where we're going to parse a stringified version of the time like this. Then we're going to concatenate it by using Lodash that we have, and we're going to concatenate it with the array of the state and then the new parse time. Right? So now when we go back and we start the timer, and then we log it, and we log it again. Now when we go and look at the state, now we have the actual, all the time values basically for that specific time stamp, pretty much, right? And then now that we did that, now we have to actually somehow display it, right? So in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to render a thing, we're going to render a times list basically. So this times list will go here in a div tag, and we're going to call it times list, and it'll do we'll check if this.state.mode is timer, and if so, then we are going to render the time list, right? And we'll just do, import time list from components and then time list, right? So now in our components thing, we need to create a new file called timelist.css, another one, new one called timelist.js. Copy this as a placeholder. Then we don't need this. This is just timeless, right? We can take all of this out, this part, and we can just go all the way down, right, like that. Okay, so then in our timeless component, right, I'm going to have a function called render timelist. This renders our timelist, and we're going to actually bind that function up here so that we can use it later. And then we're going to have it where we do div class name timelist. Then the title of this thing is going to be time list, and then the actual list itself go here, and this will be this dot render time list. And then we're gonna have some CSS. Well, no, we don't need CSS for this one. So now timer is not defined, we just have to export the right thing, time list. So now we go back up here, or down here, we have our time list. We need to add a little bit, we just have to add a little bit CSS to make this look spaced properly. So if we go back up here, back to our app CSS, we'll do times list and then margin top of 16 pixels. That looks fine, right? So now for our time list, we're gonna have to have we need to be able to get the okay, we're good on time. All right, so what we need to do is we need to add another container, because this is where we need to actually display the times, right? So we'll have time list container, right? And it's going to basically be a copy of this one, but it's going to import time list. And then in the map state to props thing, we're going to have recorded times, and this will be state.tracked times. And then instead of add time as an action, since we're going to be displaying the cards, we're going to do delete time as an action, right? And this will do take in time IDX, right? And this will dispatch a delete time action basically for us. So so what this does is that when we go here, change it to time list container. Then we go back here, containers time list cannot resolve. Let's see why. Time list container, right? When we go up here, timer not defined. When we go up here and we make sure it's time, we import the timeless component. We also do that here, right? When we go back here and we look at the props, now we have a recorded times array. And then when we log new stuff, then it changes the recorded times array per prop for the times list component, right? So now for the times list, or the time list, we need to display time card. So now we need to get another component, and we'll call this time card. Just put this here. We don't need this. We don't need this. So we just change all those three things, so that way it's actually a time card component. Then in our time card component, we're going to have a function that renders the time, takes in the time as a parameter. We're also going to import easy timer, so we can actually parse the time values correctly. And then, so that's the function that we will bind actually. Right? And then in our render function, instead of timeless, we're going to be doing a time card. And then it'll do h3. We'll have a header tag that's h3. This will be our time text. And then this will be, it will do the rendering of the time. And then this will be this.props.time. So it'll be the time value that we passed to the component. Then we'll have a button. And this will be a red one with a trash icon from Font Awesome, like so. And so it renders the time here. For now, we can just do return. So it renders the time in the time card, and that's that. But we didn't add any logic to it yet. So now we're going to add the CSS to it. It's very similar to the other cards that we've had, you know, just margin top, border of 2 pixels, solid gray, padding of 16 pixels, and then border radius of 10 pixels. Then we're going to take the time text, and we're going to do text align center for that. So then for our time list component, we're going to import, the time card from the time card, and it's in the same directory, so we can just do the /, right? And then since we're going to also import Lodash for the business logic, right? And then in our render time list function, we're going to get all the times from the props, so reported times. We're going to have a variable called time cards, and it's going to be a iteration, or it's going to use a map function, and it's going to iterate over the times array, and it'll have a function where it's time and the ID index of that time, and then we're also going to bind that function to this. You'll see why in a moment. So this will return a time card with a delete time function, and then in curly brackets is the parentheses arrow function, and then this props delete time, and then appropriate IDX. It's going to have a key of IDX, and then it's going to have a time of time in curly brackets, and then we're going to have a self-closing tag. Save it and make sure that it's formatted all well, and then since we mapped it all to the time cards array, we can just return time cards. So now if we go back, and we log some times, now we have these, but these don't do much right now because we don't have the times correctly rendered. Well, because if we do this, it's still not rendered properly. So yeah, so let's get it to, and that's going to be really easy to do that. So let's do that real quick where we can actually render the real times. So in the render time function, instead of doing this, what we'll do is we'll create we're going to do a temporary new timer. So a new easy timer, and then a new timer .start, and then for the start values, it's going to be time, and then the time string is going to be equal to the new timer and getting the time values. I'm going to stop that new timer, and we're going to return the time string. So basically what this does is that we're creating a new timer, like a temporary new timer. We're starting that timer for basically a split second, or a split really small duration of time, so it doesn't actually do anything. Then we're saving the actual value of the time as a string. Then we're stopping the timer, and then we're returning the time string. So we're basically creating a temporary timer just for the sake of parsing the string, basically, because that's how you would have to do it in easy timer, and since the way we did it with the JSON and the parsing and everything like that. So now if we go back here, new time is not defined. Okay, and make sure it's called new timer. So now when we go back here and we start the timer and we begin logging, Oh yeah, and then you have to make sure that you use the toString function. So now it's actually a string. So now when we go here, we start the timer, we can actually begin logging times, right? And they work properly. So that's good. So now the final last thing that we have to do is we have to delete the time. And the way we do this is that if we look in our timeless component, we pass the property called delete time, which is a function that's the delete time, make sure this is spelled right, the delete time function with the current IDX in the iteration. So all we have to do is we just have to run that function here. And then if we go here, you know, log sometimes, hit the trash button. Now it's triggering the delete time redex action. We look here, look at the payload, time IDX is of 0. If we do it again, the time IDX is now of 1, which means that it's actually doing it correctly. So now what we need to do is we have to alter the state so it deletes the items that we want it to delete. So we just go here, we go to our reducers, and we're going to use Lodash again, right? So we're going to check for if it's a delete time action. We're going to let the time IDX equal the payload, because that's where it's going to pull that thing from, and make sure it's in curly brackets so that it correctly destructures it for you. Then here, let me see. All right, then we're going to have a variable called indexes, and we're going to map this to we're going to map through the state, and we're going to have a function where it's ti, and this is just going to return the index, which is the second parameter I. So this basically goes through a state, and it gets the index of each item in the state. Then what we can do is we can do var filtered indexes, and we just filter the indexes variable, right? Take an ID, we're gonna have IDX as a parameter, which is the element. We're gonna return all the IDXs that are not equal to the time IDX, essentially excluding the item that we're deleting, basically, right? Then finally, we're gonna have a map function to remap the IDXs to the current state we have, and just return all the items that have the corresponding indexes that weren't filtered out, basically, or that still exists within the filtered indexes variable. And this has the IDX element again, and we're just returning the state. We're returning each element that has a corresponding IDX that still exists. So now if we go back, right, we log a couple of times, we hit the trash button, it deletes it. And to see for sure that it actually works, we can log some times as we go. And then we can stop this, you know, then we can hit the trash button, trash this one, there we go. And that's that. That's basically the last piece of functionality for the application. So basically, to sum this up, in final tutorial, cool. All right, that was only like 30-ish minutes. So in the final tutorial, basically what we did was we added the ability to record times and delete those times, and then we altered it, or we saved all that data in a single state container with Redux, basically. So we are a single store, and it's a mutable store, basically, or it's designed to be immutable. So we used Redux, we created the store here, we created the reducers here, and then in order for us to interact with this state, we had to create containers that would wrap around components for us, that would add extra functionality to those components, so that way we're not directly interacting with the store when we don't need to, basically. And then we also added these constants that were part of these actions, right? And these actions would be prepackaged data that we would trigger, or we would dispatch to the reducers, right? And so you'd have a type and a payload, and then here we'd use a switch statement to check for each of these types, and if it was one of these types, then we would grab the corresponding data from the payload, and then return a new state, basically, without modifying the old state. So basically retaining that immutability, basically. So for each action, it's a chain. It's a chain of actions and states. So that way when you look at like when you go here and you look at things, you know exactly what actions happen to get exactly to that state, basically. So we know that in order for us to get to this state that we're in right now, what we did was we added a time, deleted a time, added a time, added a time, added a time, deleted, and then that results in this final state that we're at right now, basically. So yeah, so that was the fourth and final session on how to create a web timer application with React.js. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And definitely the application has room for growth, but this is all like very core pieces of functionality that you see in a lot of other time applications. So I mean, feel free to always extend past it and stuff. I'll be sure to put this in the project resources, the last and final version, to hopefully whenever this video comes out. If you liked it, please be sure to follow and look forward to seeing future tutorials by me and I guess LiveEDU for that matter. So yeah, stay awesome, everybody.